So today we're absolutely delighted to have Bob Cesca with us, perhaps a name that you don't immediately associate with Yes, but you really should, as we will hear in just a moment. Bob appears to be a man of many parts. Wikipedia says he's a director, producer, writer, actor, blogger and political commentator. He's managing director of the Daily Banter, a news and opinion site where he also writes a daily political column, it says. And this is mainly what you can find out on the web about Bob. But then Wikipedia goes on to say he directed music videos for Iron Maiden, Yes, Everclear, Motley Crue and Meat Loaf. He also designed, of course, and the reason why we're here today, the album sleeve for the Yes album Magnification and the DVD release Symphonic Live. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you so much, Kevin and Mark. I really appreciate you having me on your show, and so many stories to tell about that period of time.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to it. So, and I think it's a story which I've never really heard told before. So let's get straight into it. How did you find yourself involved with Yes?
Well, I had been a Yes fan going back to, I'm a Gen Xer, so I would go back to 90125 as the first Yes experience I had. And I really became a fan in the late 80s and early 90s, right around the time of ABWH and the Union album and all of the turmoil surrounding that. Mm-hmm. And then we fast forward into the .com era around the year 2000 or so. Yeah. And I was running an animation studio, a cartoon animation studio at the time. And I had done a couple of cartoons that went viral, like Flash cartoons. There was one about Metallica and Napster that I did that was pretty popular at the time, got a lot of downloads around May of 2000. And so I ended up bumping into this guy named Jordan Burliant, who turned out to be a music manager. And he originally contacted me to do sort of the Napster versus Metallica thing, but with Motley Crue, which he was managing at the time. So in addition to all of that, Jordan and I got to talking about some concepts to do a cartoon TV show. So we went up and we were scheduled a meeting with VH1. And this is, I swear to God, this is going to loop back around to Yes. Right before this meeting that we had up at VH1 in New York City, I met him at his hotel, this guy Jordan, who ran Left Bank Management at the time. And what I'm getting to is, as I'm standing there in his hotel room, I look down and I see on his laptop, he's got the Ladder album cover by Roger Dean as his desktop wallpaper. And I said, "Oh, you like Yes?" And he goes, "Well, I like Yes, but I also manage Yes." And then, of course, at that point, that had never come up, and I was completely blown away because I was, of course, a big-time Yes fan. And I mean, really, seriously, one of my top 3 favorite bands. Usually the trifecta is like Yes, Rush, and Genesis. And that, of course, was in there for me. And so we got to talking, and I told him that I had seen the Ladder tour recently. And in fact, my daughter at the time was a big fan of Billy Sherwood. And I was telling him about that. And then one thing led to another. When it came time for Yes, I think about that period of time, they started working on Magnification. And at that time, it was going to be 1 hour-long song. I think that was the plan for Magnification. Right. At that time. It was about the summer of 2000. And which, of course, as we all know, that never came to fruition as one long hour-long epic, which I would have loved to have heard. And so when Magnification was in the process of being recorded, it also happened that show that Jordan and I pitched to VH1 got greenlit for a pilot and then a first season. And my thought was, boy, wouldn't it be great to have Yes record the theme song for the cartoon show? I went immediately to that. Not that I'm necessarily associating Yes with cartoons, but I thought they could do something fun and interesting that would launch the show. And so I brought that up with Jordan, and he brought it to the band, and they thought it was a great idea. Well, it turns out he invited me out to Santa Barbara, where the band was recording Magnification. And so I got to go and spend some time with Yes in Santa Barbara in the studio as they were wrapping up mixes and some final things. In fact, they were working on the final touches of Don't Go at that point in time. And the theme song, it turns out that they were recording for my show. And you can feel free to jump in here because I could just go on and on and on with this story.
No, it's fascinating. Keep going.
But the theme song for the show that they recorded for me was actually recycled for the middle 8 of Don't Go. So that middle section where John sings through a little bullhorn.
Yes.
Yeah, that whole section was actually repurposed for Don't Go, but it was based on theme song. And in fact, if you look at there's a little bit of a B-roll section of footage that's on the Yes Symphonic DVD. And a lot of that footage came from my trip to Santa Barbara to see the band. And so it was just trippy for me to sit there. We went and had lunch, and I sat across from Steve Howe, and we talked about veganism and things like that, which I was at the time.
Yeah.
And so it was blowing me away. And in fact, one of the things they asked me at that lunch was, are there any songs that the band or that fans want the band to play on this tour? And immediately I went to, well, everyone wants to hear South Side of the Sky live, and everyone wants to hear Mind Drive from Keys to Ascension too. And those would be like at the top of my wish list. Turns out that when Rick rejoined the band after the initial Magnification tour, they ended up performing both of those songs live. So I feel like I can, to a certain extent, take credit for that. But the idea of me meeting with the band at that point in time evolved into, well, why don't you film some things, do some animation and things for the concert tour. And one of the things that happened was out of that, I started designing the cover elements for Magnification. I knew that there was no way that I would ever replace Roger Dean. I could never match that quality of artistry and imagination. But I thought, well, why don't I try to create a story around this? So that's when John and I started collaborating on the initial ideas for the interdimensional reality machine, which on John Anderson's website, he wrote a whole story about the backstory of this machine. And originally, my concept for that was something that was more steampunkish, that had rusty metallic elements and clockworks and things like that. And that's kind of how it worked. And then John said, well, why don't you make the spheres into glass and so on? and this was going to be kind of a theme that would be interspersed visually into their concert, maybe as rear screen projection or something like that.
So, and the first question I guess I want to ask is actually involving the artwork. The album artwork has, like you said, that sort of space technology, mystical theme, and also including the sort of schematics of that interdimensional reality machine and a 3D model of John Anderson's Elias of Sun Hillow logo. Was that all directly from John, or was that some of that also kind of your creation?
Well, I originally was what happened eventually in sort of early summer of 2001 is Jordan came to me and said, well, the band is probably not going to use Roger Dean for their album cover. So do you want to try? Do you want to throw out some designs and things like that? And that's kind of how it got started. There was no official, you make the album cover, go. And there was no real official word like that. It just kind of evolved that way. And, I think everything that you see on the album cover for Magnification is kind of steered by John. Originally, the cover, the front cover especially, had an entire scene in the foreground that I originally designed. And as John and I talked, more of those design elements kept getting pulled out until it was just a star field with kind of the Close to the Edge cover in mind, with the Tales from Topographic Oceans cover in mind, where it was more space-oriented, a Starfield sort of a theme to that. And but if you want a sense of what the original foreground elements were, during the concert tour, the band actually had these dark tendrils or something hanging from the backdrop. And it was sort of a scene like that, where there was a cliff and a bridge, and then this, what became known as the talisman, which is, as you said, it was it wasn't the Elias of Sun Hillow icon, but it was a relative of that icon. That was originally intended to be sort of the ancient version, the Fairy Kingdom version of, that's something that John talks about quite a bit, the Fairy Kingdom. And so that became the ancient version of the glass sphere IDR, which was, the whole story is the scientist finds this ancient talisman and then wants to reverse engineer it and create a modern version of that operates, opens up new dimensions by using harmonics and music and things like, specifically Yes music. And so that was kind of the general idea. And then it kind of went from there, where the design elements took on more of the talisman and less of the IDR. And so I started incorporating that into more scenes and just throwing images and ideas at the band. And, the Magnification cover is what we got.
So, I mean, I think it's absolutely beautiful, the artwork that you came up with. And for me, it's by far the most effective non-Roger Dean artwork Yes have ever had. And it really does seem to have the spirit. And the way that you've described how it developed and so on, it has the spirit of Yes in it, for me, the same way as Roger's does. And as I said before, I had a desktop image of those spheres on my desktop for a long time at work. But I was fascinated. You've got a sort of mixture. I'm leafing through the booklet for the Magnification CD at the moment, and I can see all those elements you've been talking about, the talisman, etc., and all the interdimensional reality machine, etc. But then the front cover and the back cover with those spheres, are they computer generated? How did that all come about?
Yeah, everything is computer generated. It's
right.
a mixture of CG software and Photoshop. In fact, some of the later designs that went into there was an EP at the time, and there were a lot of different versions of Magnification that came out. Unfortunately, we had all these design elements that I worked on with John throughout 2001 that we were able to incorporate in one way or another. Some of it ended up on the Yes Symphonic interior liner notes and things like that, which I was much happier with. I was much happier with the way the Yes Symphonic stuff, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I was much happier with those design elements than I was with Magnification. So what I wanted to do actually with the cover was, because it became so bare bones, what I tried to do is incorporate some subtle design elements within the star field. So you'll see in there, if you look carefully, the Dead Sea Scrolls are in there. I mixed in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the purple nebula kind of imagery that you see in there. Plus, there's some ancient star maps in there. I think Copernicus, and there's some interesting little design elements that I incorporated. Plus, there's a series of spheres at the bottom of the album design, and those little spheres, those little circles, correspond with the design elements of the IDR. So it was all kinds of numerology being discussed too. So there's elements of 7s and 13s and things that John was really studying at the time too. So we threw all that in there.
Very cool. So we will jump back, obviously, to Magnification for some more, but I wanted to ask you something about the Symphonic Live now. For the DVD release of Symphonic Live, you developed the artwork into animated graphics. So how was that sort of developed?
Well, at that point in time, I had already designed a lot of the cover and interior design elements, and some of the animation was just some things we were discussing along the lines of the Yes Symphonic album. And originally we were going to create a whole story. The word that came down from the band's management was try to create some kind of story that we can use, almost like Pink Floyd's The Wall, where we have some kind of visual storytelling that corresponds with the songs on the album.
Nice.
And that when some of those songs are performed live, we can see some of those story elements. And what ended up happening is I think John and I decided that we didn't want the Never-Ending Story Part 2, which it was turning out to be. And so instead, the band and the band's management said, well, why don't you do some individual little clips that maybe we can do with rear screen projection during the concert, which never actually happened. But what they ended up doing is incorporating some of these animated clips into the DVD, which, much to my chagrin, as the person who worked on the clips to a certain extent, I was not happy with the Blu-ray, because the Blu-ray constantly has the animation. You don't have the choice of turning off the animation. But eventually it became sort of like Yes Songs, where they said, well, the Yes Songs has all the imagery of the jellyfish and the undersea tendrils and things like that. That was the original idea after the story got dropped. So once the story got dropped, I said, well, just put some design elements in there and we'll do some things and we'll throw it in. And I think, I forget his name, but the director of the Yes Symphonic Live video was formerly of Hypnosis, so he and I talked a lot about, Hypnosis coming in and doing the cover designs for Going for the One and Tormato, and we kind of talked about replacing Roger Dean. Like, this is so challenging. This is, and I love Roger Dean's artwork. And my intention was not to take his job away from him or anything along those lines. It kind of just fell in my lap. I never lobbied for that. No. But that was something that we discussed too with the guys from Hypnosis who ended up directing the Symphonic Live video.
Yeah, it's fantastic stuff. So, but of course, you managed to incorporate Roger Dean's Yes logo into that. Did you have to, communicate with Roger about that?
No, I think that was just a rights thing where they decided, okay, we're going to spend the money to use the Yes logo. I'm not sure if they actually had, I don't know what the financial or contractual situation was, but they did get Roger's permission. to use the logo itself. So I recreated that and made a CG version of that I rendered, as you see, with the glassy elements. And then I did a CG animated version of the logo that kind of flies over the camera like the beginning of Star Wars at the beginning of the Yes Symphonic Give Love Each Day overture. Yeah. And that was, I actually met with Roger after I started doing all that stuff, after the Magnification cover design was in progress. And I went to him. He was doing an art show in Manayunk, Pennsylvania, and I stopped by that art show. Steve was also there. And I took Roger aside. I said, I swear, I didn't lobby to take your job. I just want you to know that I love your work, and I so admire all the work that you've done, Yes, and other bands. And, I just was sort of doing a mea culpa, like making sure that Roger Dean didn't hate me, because I knew that once I was done working with the band, I would still want to be a fan of the band and going around thinking, boy, half the band hates me and half the band likes me. I didn't want that, tainting my love of their music.
Well, it's an incredibly successful, I think, those CGI elements in the Symphonic Live DVD, Blu-ray. Well, maybe not the Blu-ray so much as you say, but the DVD certainly. But you also filmed a live promotional video for Don't Go, and also your documentary, which I just watched again today, which is great fun, called Dreamtime, which includes some brilliant footage behind the concert scenes and interviews with all the musicians, not just the band, but other musicians involved as well. What was it like being able to see all those different people's creative processes and then to talk to them about it?
Well, it was so fun to work on the video elements too, because it was really guerrilla filmmaking. I mean, the Don't Go video, for example, I had a camera. This is before HD cameras were really a thing, maybe a few years before that. So it was not the greatest equipment in the world, but what I basically did is at a couple of the shows, I just ran around with the camera myself, handheld, and just shot a bunch of footage, as much as I could get. And then the band's management had me cobble all that together into a video for Don't Go, which came out before all the Yes Symphonic footage was created. So it actually, there were a few design elements that they used in the Yes Symphonic Live video that were kind of related to some of the things I did. Some of the split screen and so on was eventually incorporated into the Yes Symphonic video. But, I did that. I think it was, some of it was I think all of it was in Pennsylvania. There was one show that was in somewhere in it was Holmdel, New Jersey. That's where some of the footage was shot. And then the other footage of interviews and things like that, that's when the band was staying at the Four Seasons in downtown Philadelphia for their Philadelphia show. Yes. And so I interviewed the band there in the center square and then followed them around to some of their appearances. And it was all just supposed to be a collection of B-roll footage, for electronic press kit. And then I kind of just assembled it into a semi-narrative where we start in Santa Barbara recording the album, and then we end up meeting the fans at the show, and everything is fully evolved at that point. So that was kind of the intention there. And, it's an interesting story about that period of time, because the band never seemed to find its footing with timing. We all know that Magnification was originally set to be released on 9/11, which is a terrible, almost looking back. I mean, at the time it was so tragic. Looking back, it feels really Spinal Tap-ish. That here's this wonderful album which had some of their best music, I think, of the modern era, and then I became associated with the band, and what happens? It's scheduled to be released on 9/11. But, when I met with John in Philadelphia at the Four Seasons to do that interview footage that you see on that Dreamtime video, initially when he sat down, I remember at that point, John and I had developed a pretty good relationship. We spent a lot of time, hours and hours and hours talking on the phone. And when he initially sat down for that interview, I said, well, John, how you doing? How's the tour going? And the first words out of his mouth the first word was terrible. Terrible. He was very unhappy at that point in time. I think, and you read about this with bands all the time. In fact, Rush has a couple of stories along these lines where they have such high expectations and they're riding this wave of excitement. They've done this amazing album and they're doing this tour with an orchestra and a conductor, and it's this just some of the most incredible music, and yet no one was buying the album. And, concert sales were pretty good, but I think they were just generally unhappy. It was that big letdown after the initial expectations for Magnification. I think that's what really hit them. And as well as the bad timing of 9/11 and all of those things. So it was a weird contrast between some amazing music and just really horrible timing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, going back to the documentary, though, which is fantastic, and you mentioned the fact that you saw fans on that, and you talked to some fans, in fact, in the documentary. But one of the bits which really caught my attention was when a fan picks up a Magnification T-shirt. So there you are, you're a Yes fan. What does it feel like to have artwork that you've created on an official Yes T-shirt?
Well, now looking back, I'm really proud of all of that. And it was an amazing experience, one that, I don't think I'll ever repeat. Getting to work with my favorite band in the world and being on a first name basis with John Anderson and Chris Squire. And by the way, Chris Squire was an absolute dream to work with. Of all the members of the band, Chris, I got along with the best. In fact, I went on to do the cover for the second Conspiracy album with Billy Sherwood, which was more computer design, more of a dark tableau.
Yeah.
But it was... At the time, I was not happy with the Magnification cover. I just felt like it had been whittled down to something, and then the pressure to rise up to the level of Roger Dean was extraordinary. And, I remember releasing once the label gave the go-ahead, I remember posting the cover online, and especially the alt.music.yes newsgroup.
Yeah.
And the reactions were kind of, it was kind of what I was fearing. Like, okay, listen, guys, I'm never going to replace Roger Dean. This is what came out. It went through this enormous meat grinder of a creative process between me and John, which we've all heard the stories about, working creatively with John. John wants what John wants, and there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, his instincts have worked very, very well for the band, and I was very deferential to what he wanted. But at the time, it wasn't exactly my vision for how this would have turned out. And what indeed ended up being my vision is there's an inside gatefold inside the Yes Symphonic DVD and album that has this, has the talisman with this sunset in the background and the water in the foreground, everything like that. And that's kind of what more of what I had in mind. So it was all at once thrilling and disappointing at the same time to see, to answer your question, to see those design elements on T-shirts and see fans buying the shirts and so on and buying the album. And then the greatest thing, though, was seeing the album released on vinyl, which I have a couple of copies of here. And that really revitalized my confidence and feeling of pride around Magnification, seeing it in vinyl in that big format.
Well, I've got my copy of the vinyl just here in front of me. I've been looking at it as we are speaking, and yes, on the back, the beautiful spheres with the. Is that a woman in the background, a woman's face? Just it's lovely.
Yeah, that was a number of different kind of mix and match design elements that appeared and then disappeared, then appeared again, and ended up being in there somewhere. Obviously, part of this long backstory that we created around those design elements. And again, as I said earlier, the intention was, I'm never going to top Roger Dean, so let's make a story. Let's make something that maybe we can carry forward into future albums as this ongoing narrative that runs concurrently with the band's story somehow. And that was the idea.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, all these comments about the making of the cover and the documentary and stuff. And I mean, we touched upon how 9/11 obviously affected the sales of Magnification drastically, and they weren't the only band, of course, that suffered. I mean, I know Dream Theater had issues with their release as well around the same time. But what I'm kind of curious about is what would you say, though, was the most difficult aspect of working with Yes?
Oh, well, boy, that's a good question. It was everything, as I said, everything that we've heard about John, as far as John's creative process, is pretty accurate. I mean, I would get, a call at 2 a.m. where, John would be on the other end of the line talking about the fairy kingdom and talking about Tula, the bird that lost its song or whatever, or the little girl who paints pictures or paints music, I think was the idea. That was one of the stories. There are a lot of the stories that John invented around that period of time, Tula and this little girl who paints music. And these were all stories that were pitched to me. And not like I had there was no need for him to pitch it to me. He could have just said, do this, and I would have done it. But I think it was a challenge to all at once do something that I was happy with and that I thought the fans would like versus what was actually going on. And I was just terrified. I was absolutely terrified of how this was going to turn out, because there was no way. I'm an artist by, all kinds of different training and things. I can do watercolor and all kinds of different painting and sculpture and so on. But I hadn't done any of that for a long time. So I was working in computer graphics and animation. And I knew that was going to be kind of a jarring change from the Roger Dean look. And so these were all things that were just flying through my head at the time. How am I going to live up to this? How are the fans going to receive it? Am I going to be hated? Is this going to be another Tormato situation with the tomato on the cover? And by the way, I loved your podcast about Tormato, and I agree with you about that album. But it's one of those things that's divisive among the fans. And I didn't want to be, a divisive character with fans. And it was going to happen anyway. It was inevitable because of the loyalty to Roger Dean. And I think the sad part that came out of all of that is in Santa Barbara, the member of the band, well, the two members of the band that I got along with the most were Chris Squire and Steve Howe. I had a really long conversation with Steve Howe in the studio about his guitars. We talked about Turbulence. We talked about working with Bill Bruford. And some of that is in the video on the DVD. But once I replaced Roger Dean, that whole relationship just turned cold. I don't think Steve didn't even want to acknowledge me at that point, which, look, I understand. Roger Dean is a friend of his, and Steve is really, pushes Roger as being the visual representation of Yes, and I totally get that.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're coming to the end of the time we've got, but let's end on a favourite memory. Let's end on something really positive. A favourite memory of working with Yes in this period.
Well, I think for me, the high watermark, the best moment, and the moment that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life very distinctly, was in Santa Barbara, where I don't know what was going on in the studio, but Chris was out in the lobby in this little lounge area. And as someone who has dabbled in bass playing for a while, inspired by, Chris Squire and Geddy Lee and people like that, I wanted to talk with him about playing the bass and his, philosophy about, his instrument and so on. And I ended up sitting there playing that silver Fender bass of his that he used mostly on Magnification. He used it in concert quite a bit for that tour, and going back several years as well. And I'll never forget that, playing bass in front of Chris Squire. Clearly, I was a much younger man with much more bravery about me that I decided I'm going to play bass in front of the greatest bass player in the history of rock and roll. And then he talked about, we were discussing playing with an orchestra, and he was telling me about how, during Time and a Word, they used to hang the microphones for the orchestra off of coat hangers in front. It was just all these great stories. And I really developed a close relationship with Chris. Yeah. And after the shows, we would hang out together backstage and talk. And the other memory that's very similar to that with Chris Squire was at, their Philadelphia show. They played at this amphitheater, and I believe it was during Gates of Delirium, where Chris came over, he would leave the stage for Soon. Yeah. And I remember standing there with Chris Squire on his side of the stage, but backstage, watching the concert with Chris Squire, and just both of us standing there looking at what's going on. I'm standing, and I look to my right, and there's Chris Squire standing there right next to me. And we got along. We liked each other. And so that was just such an incredible thrill. I mean, I remember being in college, and I had a poster of Chris Squire in my dorm room, and there I was hanging out with him. It was just a thrill.
Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you so much for sharing some of those memories and telling us about this story, which I knew was going to be really interesting, and I was absolutely right to hear about the development of the artwork for Magnification for Symphonic Live. So it's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Really appreciate it. Thank you to both of you.
Hello, this is Roger Dean, and you're listening to the Yes Music Podcast. Allegedly.
Fabulous stuff from Bob. And just before we go, here's the patron update. Eddie offered